Most people who have heard of the Book of Enoch think of it as a single forbidden text, one book removed from the Bible containing dangerous secrets. The reality is more interesting and more complicated than that. There are actually 3 books that carry the name Enoch: First Enoch, Second Enoch, and Third Enoch, each a distinct composition, each from a different period, each with a different character and a different textual history. What is typically called the Book of Enoch, the version that surfaces in most popular discussion, is First Enoch. And First Enoch is not itself a single unified document. It is a collection, an amalgamation of several distinct literary works brought together under one name. Those works include the Book of the Watchers, the Book of the Giants, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. Each has a distinct compositional history, a distinct date of composition, and distinct theological concerns. They are not one voice. They are several ancient voices, compiled together over a long period of time, all circulating under the name of a single pre-flood figure from the genealogical record of Genesis. Right now, at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., a fragment of the Astronomical Book is on public display, reportedly for the first time ever. If you want to see a piece of this material in person, that is where it is. That fragment is real, authenticated, and available for public viewing. Before we go further, subscribe now if this kind of textual and historical exploration is what you are here for. Every week this channel examines ancient texts, scholarly debates, and the interpretive questions that mainstream discourse sometimes leaves at the edge. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. What First Enoch was trying to do. To understand the Book of Enoch, you have to understand what problem it was trying to solve. Genesis chapter 6 contains one of the most cryptic passages in the entire Hebrew scriptural record. In just a few verses, it states that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, came to them, had children with them, and those children were the Nephilim, described as the heroes of old, men of renown. That is essentially all Genesis says. No explanation of who the sons of God were, no explanation of what made the Nephilim different, no account of what happened to them. The passage opens a door and then closes it immediately, leaving readers across 2,000 years of scholarship to debate what it means. The ancient world had multiple answers to that question. The Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, the Septuagint, translated the word Nephilim as gigas, meaning giants. That is one stream of interpretation, and it influenced how the passage was read across a significant portion of the ancient world. But there was also a more naturalistic stream of interpretation, one that read the sons of God not as supernatural beings but as human beings from a righteous lineage, perhaps the descendants of Seth. That reading avoids the supernatural dimension entirely and has had its own long history in biblical scholarship. What the Book of Enoch represents is a third approach, the most elaborated, the most narratively developed, and for many centuries the most influential among certain communities. Enoch asks, who exactly were these sons of God? What were the Nephilim in concrete terms? How did this situation arise, and what were its consequences? It answers those questions through a detailed narrative built around a figure identified as the great-grandfather of Noah, and the answers it offers are specific, structured, and unusual in ways that mainstream Enoch scholarship has been examining and discussing for well over a century. The Watcher narrative, what it claims. The Book of the Watchers, chapters 1 through 36 of First Enoch, identifies the sons of God as a specific rank of beings called Erin in Aramaic, translated by scholars as Watchers. 200 of them are said to have descended to Mount Hermon, a specific named location, and to have entered into a collective oath binding them to their decision before they took human wives. Their offspring, the Nephilim, are described as enormous beings caught between two worlds, their fathers supernatural, their mothers human. When they died, the text addresses directly what happened to their spirits. Chapter 15 of First Enoch contains what the text frames as a formal divine ruling on this question. Because the Nephilim were born of both spiritual and physical lineage, their spirits belonged fully to neither world. They could not go where the angels went. They were not simply human souls. They were, in the text framework, something new and something uncategorized. And so they remained, disembodied, wandering, aimless, constantly drawn toward physical forms they could not properly inhabit. Possessing bodies that were not theirs, making those bodies do things those bodies were not meant to do, and ultimately causing destruction through that misfit union. This is the Book of Enoch's framework for what demons are. And it is worth understanding clearly, this is a framework that was not invented in the margins of ancient religion. It was a mainstream stream of thought in ancient Judaism in the centuries leading up to, during, and after the time of Jesus. The Dead Sea Scrolls community at Qumran copied First Enoch 11 times. They were not a fringe sect preserving a fringe document. They were a serious religious community engaging seriously with a text they considered important. The New Testament itself arrives in a world where this conversation was already happening. When Jesus and his disciples encountered demons, as the Gospels record, they did so within a cultural and theological world that had been wrestling with the question of what demons were and where they came from for at least 2 centuries. The Book of Enoch was part of the intellectual furniture of that world. Whether the Enochic framework, disembodied Nephilim spirits as the origin of demons, is correct is a question that falls beyond the boundaries of historical textual scholarship. What is documented is that it was the framework. It was live, serious, and influential in the world that produced the New Testament. Was First Enoch actually written by Enoch? This is where careful scholarship is worth listening to directly, because the answer is almost certainly no, and the reasons why are documented and not particularly difficult to follow. The Book of Enoch almost certainly was not written before the flood by the historical Enoch of Genesis. Several lines of textual evidence point to this. The Astronomical Book's timekeeping system is heavily influenced by the Hellenistic calendar, Greek timekeeping conventions that postdate the 4th century BCE. A pre-flood composition would not reflect 4th century BCE calendrical conventions. The Book of Dream Visions contains what scholars identify as allusions to the Book of Daniel. The Book of Daniel is associated by mainstream scholarship with the Persian period, quite late in the Hebrew scriptural timeline. A text that alludes to Daniel cannot have been composed before Daniel was written. Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, makes a relevant observation in his writings. When he discusses Scripture, he specifically states that nothing was written before Moses, effectively categorizing anything claiming pre-Mosaic authorship as outside the scriptural tradition as he understood it. Josephus was not unaware of the Enochic literature. His comment is a deliberate categorical statement. What this points to is that First Enoch belongs to a category of ancient literature scholars called pseudepigraphical, from the Greek pseudo, meaning false, and graphe, meaning writing. Pseudepigraphical literature is attributed to a famous ancient figure as a literary device, not as a literal biographical claim. The author was not necessarily trying to deceive. In the ancient world, attributing a text to a revered ancient figure was a recognized way of claiming connection to an authoritative tradition, a literary convention with its own understood rules. This does not mean the content of First Enoch is worthless or untruthful. It means its authorship claim should be understood within the conventions of its literary genre, rather than as a literal biographical assertion. Pseudepigraphical writing was common in the ancient Jewish world, produced many significant texts, and is studied seriously within mainstream scholarship as a genuine and important category of ancient literature. The canon question: what actually happened? The question of why the Book of Enoch did not make it into most biblical canons connects to a larger and genuinely fascinating question about how biblical canons were formed. And the answer is more historically specific and less conspiratorial than popular accounts usually make it. Canon formation in ancient Judaism and early Christianity was not a single dramatic event. It was a gradual, contested, multi-century process, driven by specific communities asking specific practical questions. Which texts can we trust? Which are tied to authoritative sources? Which speak consistently with what we already understand to be true? For ancient Judaism, Josephus provides a useful window. He describes a specific bounded set of Hebrew scriptures, approximately the same books that appear in what Protestants call the Old Testament, and explains that the criterion for inclusion was connection to an authoritative prophetic tradition. Books claiming to be written before Moses were, in his framework, categorically disqualified from that criterion. Enoch makes exactly that claim. For early Christianity, the process was similarly gradual. The 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were recognized as authoritative very early, partly because their connection to specific apostolic figures or close associates of those figures was traceable. Early Christian writers like Irenaeus, who was himself taught by disciples of apostles, could articulate why specific texts had chain-of-custody connections to the actual Jesus community. The letters of Paul were similarly recognized early. Other texts, including some of the later letters attributed to Peter and John, took longer, partly because the early Christians were doing genuine due diligence, aware that texts were being produced under apostolic names that had no authentic apostolic connection. Jerome, who produced the Latin Vulgate, the Latin Bible that served as the standard text of Western Christianity for 1,000 years, consulted rabbis directly when wrestling with the Old Testament question. His conversations with Jewish scholars informed his understanding of which books the Jewish tradition considered genuinely scriptural. His disagreement with Augustine on some of these questions is documented. It was a real scholarly debate between two serious thinkers working through a genuine question. The Council of Trent in the 16th century formally defined the Roman Catholic canon in response to the Protestant Reformation, which is why the Catholic Bible includes the deuterocanonical books, Tobit, Judith, First and Second Maccabees, and others, while Protestant Bibles typically do not. These books are real, available, published, and worth reading on their own terms. First and Second Maccabees contain the story of Hanukkah, the Maccabean revolt against the Greek desecration of the temple under Antiochus IV, which is not in most Protestant Old Testaments but is preserved in these texts. What the Dead Sea Scrolls add to the picture. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not a single text. They are a library, a collection of hundreds of documents representing the range of literature being copied and studied by a specific Jewish community at Qumran in the 2 centuries surrounding the Common Era. That library includes texts that ended up in the established Hebrew canon, texts that ended up in the deuterocanonical category, texts that are purely sectarian to the Qumran community, and texts like First Enoch that occupy a complicated position across multiple categories. The War Scroll is another example worth knowing about. It is an apocalyptic text, belonging to the same literary genre as the Book of Revelation, that describes an eschatological battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. Apocalyptic literature was not unusual in ancient Jewish writing. Revelation is the apocalypse that made it into the New Testament, tied to John the Apostle, but it existed within a broader context of Jewish apocalyptic writing of which the War Scroll and First Enoch are both examples. The presence of First Enoch in 11 copies at Qumran tells us something significant. This was a text that a serious, organized Jewish community considered important enough to copy carefully and preserve. The question of whether it was considered scripture by that community or simply authoritative and important is a genuine scholarly debate. The distinction matters. A text can be valuable, influential, and worth studying without being considered canonical scripture. The Dead Sea Scrolls community appears to have used it as a significant resource for their theological worldview without necessarily placing it on the same level as the Torah. What is established and what remains open? What can be independently verified? First Enoch is a real ancient text preserved across 3 independent manuscript traditions. The Qumran fragments date to before the Common Era and are held at the Israel Antiquities Authority. The Astronomical Book fragment is currently on display at the Museum of the Bible. Josephus's comment about pre-Mosaic authorship is documented in his published writings. Jerome's consultation with rabbis is documented. The Council of Trent's canon definition is documented history. The deuterocanonical books are real, published, and available. The War Scroll is a real Dead Sea Scrolls document. What is genuinely debated within scholarship, whether the Enochic framework for the origin of demons, disembodied Nephilim spirits, reflects a historical reality or represents sophisticated ancient theological speculation. Whether Genesis 6's sons of God refers to supernatural beings, to human beings of a specific lineage, or to something else. How much canonical weight the various communities that read Enoch assign to it. What the precise date of composition of each component of First Enoch is. What this documentary does not resolve, whether the Watchers descended to Mount Hermon, whether the Nephilim were real beings of the kind described, whether disembodied Nephilim spirits are the origin of what the New Testament calls demons. These are questions that ancient texts, however carefully preserved, cannot settle on their own. The scholar interviewed in the source material for this documentary expressed his own position with notable intellectual honesty. On things that Scripture whispers about, he said, "I do not want to yell too loudly." That is a posture worth adopting for anyone engaging with this material. The Book of Enoch is a genuine ancient text asking genuine ancient questions. Questions about the origin of evil, the nature of spiritual beings, and the cosmological framework within which human history unfolds. The ancient Jewish communities that copied it were serious people taking those questions seriously. The scholars who have worked on it across the last century have found it unusually specific, unusually organized, and unusually resistant to being dismissed as simple mythology. What it means, what authority it carries, what it describes about the actual structure of reality, is a question that falls to the reader, held with appropriate humility about how much any ancient text, however remarkable, can settle on its own. The documents are available. The scholarship is published, the fragment is on display in Washington, D.C., and the questions the text raises have been asked by serious people for a very long time without being fully answered. That is not a failure. That is where genuinely important questions live.